Regularly scheduled programming will not be seen, so that we may bring you the following special presentation from WVEC TV.
Receiving sporadic sniper fire.
Mention Vietnam, and this is the image that immediately pops to the mind of most Americans. After all, the world's first televised war came into our living rooms, bedrooms, and dens daily. Beginning in the early 60s in black and white, ending, after a fashion, in the 70s in living color. Such images, in such volume, are very hard to forget.
That was Vietnam then. This is Vietnam now. During the course of the next hour, we would like to show you how much Vietnam has changed. For example, we're sitting at the base of Nguyen Ba Dan Mountain, held sacred by all faiths in Vietnam. During the war, the Americans had a fire base and a communication center on the top of the mountain. The Viet Cong owned the sides of the mountain. As a matter of fact, they had a hospital here. During this hour, we would like to show you how much Vietnam has changed in the 20 years since.
This will be a very personal story. Actually, two very personal stories. One of an aging reporter revisiting the scenes of his most difficult assignment. The other, the return to Vietnam of Thanh Nguyen and her daughter Vanessa, their first sight of their native country since 1978, and a family reunion none of us will ever forget. And since this is such a personal story, I'd like to admit here in the early going that it will not be all that objective. Objectivity is for documentaries. This is simply an observation, a story with a little opinion thrown in for flavor. For example, Ho Chi Minh City. That's the official, politically correct name of the city we came to know as Saigon during the war years. Well, in spite of the reverence and respect that most Vietnamese hold for Ho Chi Minh, the city that bears his name is still called, by most of its residents, Saigon. But by any name, Saigon is not just a city. It's an experience. It was already crowded almost beyond belief when I left there in 1970. Today, the population is several times larger, but who's counting? Or more to the point, who could? Saigon's population of 5 to 9 million, depending on whose figures you guess to be more reliable, seems to be in constant motion. The cyclos and bicycles, the mopeds and motor scooters and pedicabs, the cars, as recent as this year, as antique as Aunt Maud's dressing table, Saigon traffic flows at a more or less constant rate from just before daylight, about 6 every morning, to well after dark. It's like a sort of semi-permanent rush hour, and amazingly, relatively few accidents when you consider the opportunities for catastrophe. But the traffic reveals a subtle and important facet of the Vietnamese character. Almost never, even in such maddening traffic, will you ever hear Vietnamese raise their voices or make the sort of unfriendly gestures most American drivers have learned to expect. It becomes clear after a while that every Vietnamese is, and must be, blissfully unaware of anything behind and unfailingly attentive to everything in front. Otherwise, it just wouldn't work. As it is, there's a rhythm of traffic in Saigon. It flows smoothly, defying the laws of physics because it so carefully obeys the laws of good manners. Those of you who have survived a New York cab ride and think you know something about fear, you can find an experience in Saigon that makes that seem, well, relaxing by comparison.
A taxi is probably the safest way to get around in Saigon, but a cyclo ride is something no one should miss. It's an adventure. Saigon, you see, is a city of 5 million people, all of whom are going down the very street you're trying to cross.
I had often described this phenomenon to my wife Catherine over the years, but never did I see the understanding that was apparent after her first look at the streets of Saigon, combined with the sultry equatorial heat, the smells and sounds and vibrations of a society unlike anything she had seen before. In 1969 and 70, I had lived here while working as a correspondent for ABC News. My beat then, in addition to battlefield coverage, was to pay special attention to the political, social, and cultural aspects of what was, by any measure, the biggest running story in the world at the time.
Jim Kincaid, ABC News, Saigon.
In seeking out familiar places, I found that except for the model years of the cars and the absence of barbed wire and sandbags here and there, I was in very familiar territory. Can it possibly have been so long ago? There was an uncanny feeling that some of these places were too familiar, the memories too fresh to have occurred nearly a quarter of a century before. The political issues have faded into memories. The hair is grayer and the girth greater, but it still seems such a short time ago, and Catherine agreed that I had described it well. Maybe I just didn't go quite far enough.
I stood on almost exactly this same spot more than 2 decades ago. Some Cambodian monks were being assimilated into the South Vietnamese population, and they didn't want to be assimilated, so they came here to the presidential palace to protest to President Thieu. President Thieu wasn't interested in hearing their protest, and the South Vietnamese police were not interested in allowing us to see that dissent in the South Vietnamese population. I can assure you the smells and the sounds and the traffic of the city of Saigon are practically the same as the city of Ho Chi Minh City today. However, today it's a much more peaceful Sunday morning. Monks, who for the past 2.5 hours have been quite peaceful. This seems to be a rather undemocratic procedure at best.
When we come back, we'll meet 2 remarkable Vietnamese women, returning to a homeland one left as a refugee and the other could barely remember until she came. After the fall of Saigon, a great many Vietnamese found themselves either politically or economically on the wrong side of things and fled the country, mostly in overcrowded and under-provisioned boats. Among these boat people, Thao Nguyen and her 3 children. Her oldest daughter was 5 years old.
We gotta get out of this place. If it's the last thing we ever do, we gotta get out of this place. Girl, there's a better life for me and you.
Thao brings a special understanding to her current job, helping refugees find their way into a new society. Almost 2 decades ago, she had to do precisely that. A struggle complicated, no doubt, by the task of caring for and educating 3 children at the same time. Thao and her family celebrated this past Tet, a Vietnamese holiday that most nearly resembles our Christmas, New Year's, and a birthday all rolled into one, with fellow members of the Vietnamese community. Nowadays, the Vietnamese call them Viet Kieu, overseas Vietnamese, and they want them to come home, at least for a visit. Such a visit has been uppermost in Thao's mind since early this year, when we proposed that she and her daughter Vanessa make such a visit and let us witness their return and their experiences and be a party to their feelings about it all. The return was about as unlike the departure as possible. Instead of a leaky boat packed with people bound for an uncertain destination and an even more uncertain future, Thao and Vanessa arrived on a scheduled 7:47.
Current time in Ho Chi Minh City is 9:51.
Even a car and driver and guide waiting at the airport. And a bus, which turned out to be too big for the homecoming the following day. A tiny street, quite typical in the Binh Thanh district of Ho Chi Minh City, was not quite equal to the size of the minibus. So we walked the last few yards. Thao, Vanessa, and a street full of cameras, your reporter, guides, sponsors, and government minders. There at a small house by American standards, quite adequate by theirs, a scene that hardly needs explanation. And what explanation it does need, we'll hear from Thao and Vanessa, and voices that need not be understood at all to be perfectly understood.
That's my sister.
Your sister? Very good to know.
Má Lầu hả?
Dạ. Để em mời bác. Ai là chị lên
I want to go up. I want to see my mom. Hi.
I told you this was going to be a very personal story. But it wasn't all tears by any means, even tears of joy.
So, let me introduce myself. My name's Thoai. Thoai, T-H-O-A-I. You can call me Thoai. Yes, I'm living in this city, My Tho City. And it's a great honor for me to be with you in this trip. Yeah, we'll take you to cruise along the Mekong River.
Thao was born in My Tho, to the south of Ho Chi Minh City in the Mekong Delta. The Mekong was in the news a lot during the war years, as well it should be now. This river and the very fertile delta it nourishes provide much of the world's rice supply. And an abundance of other foods that even during the war years kept the massive starvation that often accompanies war at bay. The Vietnamese may be poor, but they eat well if they try. And they do try. One thing Thao and Vanessa did not try to do at all was to hide their pride in their native country. It was pure pleasure on a hot day with genial companions and a boat captain who was expert in navigation and in cutting fresh coconuts so our passengers could enjoy the milk. On such a day, it was easy to see how these women would take such pride, such quiet but obvious pride in the very region where they were born. Vanessa said the smells brought things back that she thought she had forgotten. That happened to me a lot too. The sights and the smells and the sounds. Some heavy-duty remembering after this.
Chow also feels that the United States' involvement in South Vietnam isn't always a purely humanitarian effort, and that South Vietnam's Buddhists from time to time are getting a very sorry deal. In short, Congressman Chow is a gadfly, and the climate here isn't very good just now for gadflies. Jim Kincaid, ABC News, Saigon. Did you ever come back to your old neighborhood and find that everything has changed? Nothing is quite where it used to be. Nothing looks quite like it used to. Well, I came back to my old neighborhood and very little has changed except the times. The old French Opera House just behind me was, in those days, the Vietnamese legislature. Just across the street at the Caravel Hotel was where I lived and where the ABC Network News had its offices. Used to walk down the street about 100 yards to the Rex Hotel, which at that time was the headquarters of the Joint United States Military Command, and there we went to an affair we called the 5 o'clock Follies. It was a military briefing on what was going on in the field. The reason we called it the 5 o'clock Follies is the information there was quite bad, but it was about the only information we had available. Well, this is weird.
It was an emotional experience, walking the same paths I'd walked as a correspondent all those years before. But this time, I had the advantage of knowing that there was no war going on, and the immense pleasure of sharing the experience, the good and the bad of it, with the person most central in my life. War correspondents rarely, at least in my experience, take their spouses to such events. And those spouses have to hear about it in bits and pieces over a long span of years.
Jim has never really written about Vietnam, about his experiences there. And so Jim went back, and it was really courageous of him to go back, to sort of take the bull by the horns, so to speak, and to go back. And I think in the long run it'll be very good for him, because now he can talk about it.
You can talk about the look of things, even the smell of things, and never really touch on the feel of things. That takes seeing for oneself. How do you explain Asia, and more to the point, Vietnam, to somebody who grew up in Luxembourg? Well, for one thing, you don't explain Asia and Vietnam well. Vietnam has a long history, and libraries full of books have been written about this particular part of Asia, and they don't explain it either. But even a woman from Luxembourg can feel it.
Yellow bird up high in banana tree. Hi.
It felt very natural. And it started right after we came out of the airport. Yes, this is it. This is the flavor, and the people, they already started to smile, and it was just wonderful.
Vietnam vibrates with so many different rhythms that I was prompted many years ago to conclude that the Vietnamese were more like us, the Americans, than anyone would suspect from the look of things. They don't look like most of us, but they do look like some of us. They like a lot of the same things. They do have a traditional work ethic that some adhere to and some don't. They have an abiding conviction, as most Americans do, that theirs is the best country on the planet. At Unicorn Island in the Mekong Delta, Catherine observed that this must be what Eden was like before the apple. But pride of place was nowhere more evident than at the restaurant La Bibliothèque.
I'm going to invite you to go upstairs after the dinner. Bon appétit. Et après le dîner, je vous invite.
Madame Dai, the owner, fed us royally on Vietnamese food, which was on the program, but then took us to her library, which was not on the program, for a presentation of music and dance from Vietnam's many ethnic minorities. Madame Dai, perhaps you should know, was a member of the South Vietnamese legislature during the war years, but usually fighting the repression she observed in the Thieu regime. Her political position was always simple, that Vietnam should run its own show, and the cultural traditions of Vietnam should be preserved. Now, after the passage of 2 decades, she's still fighting for Vietnamese culture and tradition, as undaunted as any general in the field. And these young artists are her very able foot soldiers. At Madame Dai's and on the Mekong River, in the rice paddies and on the holy mountain of Nui Ba Dan, I watched Catherine fall in love with another country, at least with its people.
The people are charming, they're wonderful, and they're kind and they want you.
For me personally, today's enjoyment of Vietnam was clouded considerably by my earlier experiences, especially on such occasions as our visit to Cu Chi, in what was once known as the Iron Triangle, where an extensive Viet Cong tunnel complex cost many Americans their lives.
You fellas actually volunteer to go down into holes like
I
that?
vividly remembered talking to 2 young Americans,
Just because you skin
tunnel rats we called them, whose job it was to explore those tunnels when they were discovered. And with no way to check back, I wondered if they made it through their tour.
Everywhere. So the pilots from the airplanes observed the ground, but they could not discover the bunkers and so on. Now, please
Part
come
of
back.
today's tour, guided by a Vietnamese officer who was a teenage Viet Cong in those days, was a propaganda film about what was then the enemy, and it was very hard to watch.
Who are the Cu Chi fighters? The Americans wanted to turn Cu Chi into a dead land, but Cu Chi will never die.
A review after the 12th program. Almost all the 12th were made for the war.
It was a great relief to leave Cu Chi and get back to showing Catherine the Vietnam I want to remember. When we come back, a look at daily life in Vietnam, a country where they seem to wage peace as hard as they waged that tragic civil war. The traffic in Vietnam is deceptive. On the one hand, it seems to tip us off to a country in a pell-mell rush to get somewhere. But on closer examination, the pace of life is actually slow, deliberate but slow. Not slow in the lazy sense of the word. The Vietnamese are anything but lazy. But do you remember Thomas Jefferson's vision of America? A country of small shopkeepers, of small farms. Well, if Mr. Jefferson were around today, I think he'd understand today's Vietnam much better than he'd understand today's America. From rice to mangoes, the farmers and their families raise their products on plots that would be considered tiny by American standards. The cultivation is still done largely by hand or by water buffalo. And on the Vietnamese farm, hardly anything ever leaves the farm but the product itself. American ecologists need only visit there to understand how far recycling can be carried. The Vietnamese farmer is so dependent on his surroundings and so much a part of his land, even in death, that good conservation is also good economics. And in a close-to-the-bone economy, the difference between success and failure. Not that the Vietnamese are resistant to new ideas. Down through the centuries, the Vietnamese have been exposed to many cultures. And when they found something good about those cultures, they kept that. Chinese influence is evident everywhere, especially in religion and art. India also had a contribution to make in those same fields. And the combination of China and India accounts for the major religion of Vietnam, Buddhism. More than half the Vietnamese embrace Buddhism, but the story doesn't end there by any means. In Vietnamese Buddhism, as in its other religions, there are overtones of Confucianism, Taoism, and animism, with ancestors and minor gods taking their place in the daily observances. It's not unusual to find different members of one family embracing different religions, but carefully respecting and even paying attention to each other's shrines. Common to all Vietnamese religions, including Catholicism, respect for the elders of the family and deceased ancestors, which probably accounts for the reverence one sees on every side in Vietnam for the very old. The French colonial days are remembered in the language, the architecture, and the bread. Oh, the bread. The French themselves would have to admit that they learned the bread lesson very well. Vietnam had only a few years to absorb some American culture, and we might question whether they made as good a choice as they might have. The desire for America to be a part of their future is clearly displayed in such performers as these, which we and the Return to Vietnam crew irreverently dubbed the Don Ho Chi Minh Singer. Most older Vietnamese, North and South, were taught French as a second language. But in the shops and restaurants, the signs and the menus are in English. And if you take a taxi, a real taxi, US dollars are the only accepted currency. Even at Madame Dai's library, where Vietnam's many ethnic minorities were celebrated for our pleasure, the master of ceremonies spoke English. And the performers departed from their ethnic program in a way that spoke fluent welcome.
Oh, Susanna.
Several days and many miles away on Unicorn Island, We happened upon a wedding feast, and all at once found ourselves among the guests.
Would they mind if I take a picture of that?
No problem, sir.
They said that that's the party for the bride, and he want to invite all us to join the party.
Oh, how sweet. That is very nice.
The whole reason we were invited to the wedding was because it's very good fortune in that part of the world during an auspicious event to have a wealthy person visit under your roof. So that person's good fortune will go with you. And as far as they were concerned, we were extraordinarily wealthy. Anybody who could come halfway around the world would have to be wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. It's a form of courtesy that you must do. See, the host came and poured a glass of the rice whiskey and handed it to me.
And of course you have to.
There was no choice. You know, I had absolutely no choice.
I'll fall off the boat. Okay, one time. Here we go.
That stuff will clean out your sinuses. I mean, that's some tough stuff. It really was some tough stuff.
I thought it was rather good.
Well, you see, you got to sip yours.
I was invited to toast just about everybody there, and complied, since turning down offered hospitality is considered very bad manners in Vietnam.
This is a bride.
I left reluctantly and unsteadily. I think I called out congratulations when leaving.
Chúc mừng!
Chúc mừng! Bravo!
More miles and days away, we took part in a daytime service at the Holy See of the Cao Dai religion. It would take volumes to explain the Cao Dai, but in the smallest of nutshells, if you have it in your religion, the Cao Dai probably have it too. Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Confucianism are among the main beliefs embraced by the Cao Dai. But its pantheon of saints includes some surprises, such as Victor Hugo and Winston Churchill, and others you might never have thought of as religious figures. The Cao Dai, in fact, is almost a surreal image of Vietnam itself, open yet deeply mysterious. A simple picture with hundreds of complex surprises within it. When we come back, a further look into today's Vietnam, and some of those who will have a hand in shaping the Vietnam of tomorrow.
Tao and Vanessa, and for that matter all of us in the Return to Vietnam crew, were often asked how much control was exercised by the Vietnamese government. Well, some, I guess, but it was very subtle.
though there was an amount of paperwork, formalities, and procedures that our producer, Pete McKelvin, described as unbelievable. Still, we were not refused permission to go anywhere we asked to go, and the government minders spent more time helping with equipment and such than policing our efforts. Mr. Fong, for example, acquired the nickname Tripod, which was only fair since photographer Doug Cesney had already been named by the Vietnamese Mr. Mango. And as for Tao and Vanessa, who had feared at least some unfriendly attitudes for old political differences, nothing of the sort happened. Now we come to two matters that the Vietnamese government might have been able to set up to show us the best-case scenario. Thanh Nguyen had requested a visit to an orphanage and a school.
I love children, so I want to see what's going on with their life. I'm pretty concerned about them. I think they are the future of my country.
The orphanage, similar to some I visited during the war, was clean, the children marvelously well behaved, and the facilities, by our standards, very Spartan. The major impression among us, what remarkable things could be done with so little in the way of material support. The state does help the orphanage, and some money comes in by way of private donations, but the per-child expenditure is quite meager.
I think it's a good organization, and that's more than I expect. They have a good care. Yeah, the facility is good too.
Many of the same adjectives could be used to describe the elementary school we visited in Ho Chi Minh City.
Dạ, lớp này dạy về gì đó?
Đây là dạy tiếng Việt. Hôm nay cô dạy gì cô? Dạy môn tiếng Việt.
Yeah, this is a Vietnamese class, huh?
There, again, the children were a teacher's dream when it comes to deportment and paying attention, but the facilities were very rudimentary. In fact, I was reminded of some Arkansas schoolrooms of the 40s, where the nearest thing to a word processor was chalk and a blackboard, and the visual aids included a portrait over that blackboard of the father of our country. The teachers seemed especially eager to let us know about their willingness to give their students American learning materials and equipment, and prepare them for a future they seemed quite sure and content will involve the United States as a major player. The teachers and many other Vietnamese professionals see President Clinton's lifting of the trade embargo as a major step forward in a movement already well underway, an economy not quite communist, not quite capitalist, but something of a compromise that's raising tremendous interest in the world's trading nations. The question isn't whether America will be a part of it. That's being decided even as we speak. And the answer is yes. But how big a head start some of our Asian and European competitors have? One indicator of how far the Vietnam of today has come, economically and politically, is to be found hundreds of miles away, across the South China Sea in Hong Kong, where the river of refugees that used to strain facilities and patients has become a trickle. Hong Kong is a modern, well-run city, but with overcrowding already a problem and the turnover to China just a few years away, Hong Kong has quite enough problems to deal with already. Nevertheless, it has been a port of choice for Vietnamese refugees in spite of the dangerous trip across the northern reaches of the South China Sea. At one of Hong Kong's 2 refugee facilities, the one set aside for those refugees whose circumstances allow for immigration to other countries, including the United States, we found the conditions spare, but clean and comfortable. All the refugees here will find room in other countries. One young girl we talked with is bound within weeks for the United States.
During my days covering the war in Vietnam,
I was able every 8 weeks to come here to Hong Kong, the market of Asia, for a little rest and relaxation. We called it decompression. It's an example here in Hong Kong that Vietnam could very well look to if they want to see what a real free market can do. Of course, the refugees who come here on their way to the free world very rarely ever get to Nathan Road.
We sought out Brian Bresnahan, coordinator of refugee services for Hong Kong, who confirmed some of our positive feelings about the refugee situation and the economic future of Vietnam.
Life is looking up in Vietnam. The push force which propel people to risk their lives in crossing the northern part of the South China Sea, that isn't there anymore. All the signs for Vietnam are promising. All the signs are there that, you know, in the not too distant future, albeit from a very low base, Vietnam will be one of the tigers of Southeast Asia. And I wish the country good fortune.
Maybe we Americans and the Vietnamese, are on the verge of a new Vietnam era. The old one, which neither side remembers with pleasure, did define a generation. Much of the social commentary of that generation was in the form of music. Music that tried to send a message from one generation to another. Some of it, indeed, still fits. In our final segment, maybe we can summon up the spirit of Lyndon Johnson, another casualty of the war, who wanted us to obey the biblical suggestion, "Come, let us reason together."
For most Americans, any story about Vietnam either begins or ends here in Washington, D.C. at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. For many Americans who come here, it's the first time they grasp the full enormity of that war, the thousands who died. For many who come here, it's a war they didn't understand then and still don't.
On this particular day, I couldn't help remembering that former Viet Cong colonel at the Cu Chi tunnels and the anger he still holds for Americans after all these years. And the anger this wall evokes in many hearts. And the anger on both sides, that all those people on both sides had to suffer and die, proving nothing more than mankind has proved so many times in the past, that war is a damned unsatisfactory way of settling anything. Of course, there are unsettled issues between the United States and today's Vietnam, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. Among them, the unaccounted for Americans. Former Marine Chuck Robb, a Vietnam veteran who's now Senator Chuck Robb, and keenly interested in the MIA question, believes lifting the embargo inspired greater cooperation than anyone predicted from our former enemies.
It's very clear that in even the few weeks since the embargo was lifted, that the cooperation, the real cooperation, the genuine cooperation of the Vietnamese and the authorities across the board has increased substantially. They have allowed us into areas without additional red tape. They're doing everything that they can to be fully cooperative. And the majority of the Vietnam veterans who have been back, almost without exception, have the same feeling. Signed up in 57.
We met for a 5-minute interview that turned into an hour-and-a-half conversation at the wall, and found that though we didn't cross paths in Vietnam, we shared considerably the feeling for the people we had known there, then and more recently, and shared the conviction that it's time not to forget, We should never forget the price of war, but it is time to realize that that war is over. And though the scars remain on both sides, do we really have to carry the hatred over to future generations? Isn't that what's happening in Eastern Europe and several parts of Africa, the Middle East, and Northern Ireland?
Name, sir? My name is Kai.
My name is Jim.
Okay, thank you.
There is a palpable feeling of friendliness toward Americans in Vietnam. The sort of demonstration that an efficient government might be able to set up and sustain for maybe a few hours. But the cast of characters we met, day after day, were either real or the best drilled cast of thousands in history ever to play to an audience of 6.
It's pretty hard for me to believe that I could be on a small boat in the Mekong River in a harbor like this and not be afraid, because 23 or 24 years ago in a situation like this I would have been very afraid. And again, we're seeing a lot of smiling faces. Saw them then, but you weren't sure if they were real. Today I think it's been demonstrated to us that the smiles are very real. I think if America could see the face of the Vietnamese people the way we've seen it in the last few days, maybe we could be much closer friends. Feels good. Feels very good.
Saigon, honey, 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 Saigon, honey, 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 Saigon, honey, 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 yo, things are getting better back in Saigon, Saigon, honey, 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 Saigon, honey, 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 Saigon, honey, 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 yo, things are getting better back in Saigon, Saigon, honey, 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 Saigon, honey, 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 Saigon, honey, 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 yo, things are getting better back in Saigon, Saigon, honey, 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 Saigon, honey, 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 Saigon, honey, 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 yo, things are getting better back in Saigon.
Thank you.